All right, so let's now turn to the separation of power and to those places in the Constitution where they have built in ways for one part of the government to check another part of the government. The idea behind this comes from the intuition that, you know, one can certainly separate power, have the legislative branch be in charge of lawmaking, the executive branch in charge of implementation, and the judicial branch in charge of interpretation. But the people in Philadelphia thought that it would be good to go like a step farther than that, and to also give the executive branch a little piece of the legislative power in order to enable the presidency to limit the power of the Congress. And they thought that it made sense for the executive to have a little bit of authority over the judicial branch in order to limit the judicial branch. This is really articulated pretty well by Madison in Federalist 51, where he says really the only way to get government, to get a limited government, or to limit government, is to compel the government to limit itself. The people really are not powerful enough to limit the government. And the way you do that is by enlisting the ambition of office holders, to get ambition to counteract ambition, to get the president to have some interest in limiting the Congress, because he doesn't want the Congress to be more powerful than he is, and to give the legislative body some ability to limit the executive, so that they can make sure that the executive doesn't become more powerful than they are. This is the reason behind these kinds of things. So think about them that way. The other thing that I want to say about this exercise that I'm going through right now is that I don't expect you, I mean, it doesn't make sense for people to memorize where is this, that, everything that's in the Constitution, specifically what are the section numbers and the article numbers. This isn't really the point. The reason that I'm going through it like this is so that you can see how this document is organized. And when you can see how the document is organized, it's easier to understand what it is they're doing. And it's also, it's somewhat empowering itself to kind of understand, to be familiar enough with the document that you can see all the different pieces and how they fit together. And so that's why I'm kind of pointing out, okay, here's where it is, and that's why it's here, and that's how it fits into the system. All right, so let's talk about probably the most famous of these checks, and that is the president's veto power. So again, the president has a little bit of power over the lawmaking process. Now, the lawmaking process is found in Article 1, of course, because that's the article that spells out the legislative branch power. Sorry, I keep messing up in my manipulation of these slides. And so let's scroll down. It's in section 7 of Article 1. Here is the description of the lawmaking process. And you see here the president's role in this spelled out. Now, of course, reading this paragraph here doesn't tell you everything about the lawmaking process, but it gives you the kind of the starting point of how the process works, understanding how the process works. Another kind of check you see is the impeachment process, and that's spelled out in Article 1 and Article 2. It's spelled out in Article 1 and in 2 places in Article 1. Remember, Article 1 is about the legislative branch, and Section 2 is about the House. And the House has one job in the impeachment process. They're the ones who impeach. And see, they have the power of impeachment. And Section 3 spells out the Senate, remember? And the Senate has the ability to try impeachments, right? So So the impeachment power, you'll see that in both those sections because it's divided even further among the two branches. It's also mentioned in section in Article 2, where the president being subject to impeachment is mentioned. Now, I'm not going to go through all the rest of these, but in Article 2, Section 3, you can see that the president's appointments require Senate approval. So let's just look at that one. Here's Article 2, right? And Section 3, one of the powers of the president is to make appointments. And those appointments are subject to Senate approval, and that's actually spelled out in Section 2, not Section 3. So I have to fix that. There it is. You might also think of the amendment process as a check on power. It requires both the Congress and the states to amend the Constitution. And you might also think about Section 9 in Article 1, which is the section that talks about different things that can't be done. You'll find here a reference, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. This is the idea that any federal money that's to be spent by Congress can only be spent if it's specified in a law that follows the same lawmaking process as every other law follows. So that means that appropriations have to be approved by both the House and the Senate, and then are subject to veto by the President. So these are just some of the checks and balances you'll find in the Constitution. It's a pretty complicated system. All right, so federalism as well, another element in the system. And again, federalism is the establishment of a federal government, a national government that has substantial power that was absent in the Articles of Confederation. This is really what the Constitution does. It sets up a federal government and specifies a relationship between the federal government and the already pre-existing state governments. And I've already mentioned the Commerce Clause, one of the most important parts of the Constitution with regard to federalism is the Commerce Clause. And remember, that's in Article 1, Section 8. It's the third clause, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states, right? What was happening is that the states were really trying to undermine each other's economies. Maybe New York would pass a tax on firewood coming in from New Jersey in order to protect their own firewood industry and damage that of New Jersey's. And these kinds of things were happening all over the place. States where Virginia, for instance, was trying to enter into a foreign treaty, basically with France, to get preferential trade treatment. These are the kinds of things that the Commerce Clause gave the Congress the ability to stop states from doing. And it enables really the growth of a unified economy, but it also then underlies the expansion of power later in the country's history, like I mentioned with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Article 4 talks about state and federal relations. That's where you find the full faith and credit clause, and it specifies the relationship between states and between the federal government and the states. Also crucial for federalism is the supremacy clause in Article 6 that I mentioned briefly already. Supremacy clause, the supreme law of the land. And also important is the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment added in 1791, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. For a long time in the country's history, there's a really important limitation on the power of the federal government. Not so much today. It's not as important today. And we'll talk about that a lot more when we talk about federalism.